My name is Gwendolyn. I'm the founder of The Exhale. The idea behind The Exhale is in part to offer a safe space for a community of like-minded individuals, primarily musicians and performers. And we are here to try and move things forward, to move agendas forward, to try and gain some form of insight into what it's like to be a 21st century musician. And I have been in the wonderful position to invite some very, very dear guests, friends, people I've grown up with, people I've worked with, and a new person. And I'm going to start, actually, I'm going to try and figure out how is the best way I can do this. I'm going to start in alphabetical order, because this conversation is in part about trying or assessing in what way we are and are not biased in any question to do with music, and also and that's the main point, the idea of whether as a musician it is feasible, possible to have a family and be an active performer. Claudia, to you.
Hello, everybody.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am 37 now, and I had a baby a year ago, and I'm a working soprano, a lyric coloratura soprano. I've been working maybe professionally for about, let's see, when was my first professional gig? It was probably about maybe 27, so roughly 10 years professionally. I live in Ireland. I'm based in Ireland. I've never done a fest. I've never done a prolonged period anywhere. I've always liked working in different places. I've always liked being a freelance artist. It just suited me. I liked having a base in my home. It never really interested me to live anywhere else. I am very kind of family orientated, which is, it's interesting, certainly in a profession like this that takes you away from home so much. Yeah, and I think it's a very privileged profession to be involved in. I love what I do. In fact, I always think of the quote from Joyce DiDonato that says, you're not paid to sing, you're paid to be away from home. And I suppose if there was one thing that really sticks out in this profession, it's just the time away from your family. So I think this conversation is so relevant, and especially when you start having your own family. So it's a very interesting time for me, but because I am family orientated, and I'm a very Irish girl, even before having a baby, I think it's very important to connect with your family. I mean, if you don't, even if you're not a mother, you may be a sister, you're a daughter, and so I think it's, you're an auntie. So I think it's always been maybe a bone of contention, loving what I do, but also trying to balance that with being home and spending time with family. So getting that balance. And I think if I was to pick out one, bone of contention, really, it's the lack of being able to maybe plan when you can get home. I know there's so many other professions that do bring you away. I mean, even if you work in the country that you live in, you're still leaving the house for a prolonged period of time. But I suppose it's getting on the plane and not knowing, are you going to be back? Are you going to make it back in a week? Are you going to make it back in 3 weeks? Are you going to, and it all kind of depends on scheduling when you arrive at a certain opera company, and I predominantly just work in opera. I mean, I don't do so many recitals. I do a bit of concert work. Certainly I'd like to do more now, having had a child, because it's generally shorter. But just taking a role, working in an opera company, and let's say it's a new production, and generally, rehearsals are, I think you can vouch for this, Roderick, generally 6 to 8 weeks maybe, and you're not really given a schedule. So as such, and then generally they work Saturday mornings, which really stops, if you're working within Europe, which really stops you getting home even at a weekend. So I think that's something that if I wanted to change one thing, it would just be planning. Now, I know it's not personal. The people I meet within opera are absolutely lovely. And I think we are privileged to work in a very liberal profession. I think people are quite liberal in our profession, quite open. And I think it draws people like that. But so I don't take it personally. It's not personal, but maybe it should be. And maybe more of an effort should be made to orientate the scheduling around family life a little bit more, because for me it is unbalanced at the moment. So if I had one thing to pick, it's just scheduling and being able to plan when you can get home. And I think Saturday mornings have always been a gripe with me, always, because they just don't allow you to get home. And if you do, you get home for 12 hours and then you're back on Monday morning, and then you can have, obviously it depends on your director, your conductor, if they're very nice, and if you might ask, can I get home? But I kind of, it's funny, it's a funny thing being at the mercy of people just not having an actual time frame where you're going to get back each weekend. So that's my big bone of contention in this profession. God, I started off very controversial, didn't I? Getting straight into what I don't like. But yeah, I mean, that's my biggest gripe, and always has been, even before having a child. Just getting on a plane, and even, I love my now husband, but never being able to tell my boyfriend at the time when I was actually going to get back. It was just unknown. I'll see when I get there type thing. And I don't know many professions like that where you just don't know, when I don't know if you find that, Roderick, yourself. I mean, that certainly has always been my main thing.
So I'm going to break right away with what I said, and rather than doing alphabetical order, seeing as you spoke to Roderick, I'm going to ask Roddy, tell us a bit about yourself, Roddy. Who are you? What do you do? And what is your view on family and being a musician?
Well, like Claudia, I'm a singer. I describe myself as an opera singer because it's a useful shorthand if people aren't familiar with the variety that there is in classical singing. I'm maybe different from Claudia in that I do a lot of other things in and amongst opera. So whereas an opera, as she says, might be a rehearsal period of 4 to 6 to 8 weeks and then shows, concert work and recital work tends to be 1 or 2 days, or maybe even just if it's something a little bit more local, just an in and out on the day job. So I do a lot of that, and a lot of I've done some various different things, recording and a bit of teaching and what have you. So it's a piecemeal career. So that has made it easier for me to cope with traveling. And when I say cope, I love traveling as well. I'm a bit of a Boy Scout in that sort of way. So I've been doing this for about 25, 30 years. I've been freelance. I used to be a classroom teacher for a few years after college, classroom teaching, and then I became a singer after that, and have been freelance for most of my life. And a freelance existence, just as Claudia described, is again very piecemeal. So she was saying not being able to tell her boyfriend, then husband, when she's going to be coming back week by week. If you look at the old format of 9 till 5, working as we knew it, with a weekend, and that's again, I love it that Claudia talks about Saturday mornings being the bone of contention. That old pattern, which is almost gone now, particularly in this current situation, meant that families could have some sort of routine. Like, for example, on a Saturday morning, whichever person has not been doing the childcare all week might take the children swimming. Let's put it out there. Saturday morning is swimming morning. And we know all sorts of friends who live locally to us where they have something like that, something they do each weekend they can look forward to, taking a ball, play football in the park, or just going to visit something on a Saturday, and Sunday being a family day. That sort of pattern, of course, doesn't exist for a freelancer or anybody who is self-employed in this shape, whatever the profession. Like a lot of people, if you don't know that, you won't miss it. So there has never been a stage where my wife and I have thought, oh, wouldn't it be lovely to be able to take the children swimming on a Saturday regularly? It's, that's just not been how we've done it. That is, it's also interesting about scheduling because my sister-in-law, who is also an Irish author Phelan, married to my younger brother, she is an opera director. So she is actually in control of the scheduling when it comes to her. When she's employed by an opera company. And for her, one of the first things she does, and the first thing she does, this before she had children of her own, is that she would produce a schedule for the entire rehearsal period. So she would know, given there would sometimes be illness and things, she'd have to change it slightly, but she would know which days she needs to work and with whom. So she could tell somebody, anybody, when they were going to be needed, with the caveat they might need an emergency to be brought back, but she could let them know that, because she realized how important it was for people just to have an idea of how their life is going to shape. And I'll just say one thing also about being doing this job internationally as well. What Claudia was saying about getting on a plane and going off for a rehearsal schedule that is on paper 8 weeks. We know when we accept the job, obviously, that we are on an 8-week contract, or longer if that includes performances in a foreign country and you can't get back between performances. We know that that's part of it. See Joyce DiDonato's comments. So the idea of getting back home just for a weekend is a bonus. It's not written into the contract. We know that we've signed up to be away for 2 months. The difficulty is when you think, if you're on the near continent, you might just be able to get back. What if they just let you hop back and they don't need you from a Thursday through to the following Monday or Monday evening? You could just get back. Well, English, and if you have that as a possibility, then when it doesn't happen, inside you feel really, really let down. Of course, you should just, we all know you should just let it go and think, right, I'm going to be in this country now for 2 months and just, that's it. But it's the possibility that's difficult. And in this country, we are used to the weekly schedule being printed on a Friday lunchtime or something like that, that will detail when you'll be needed for the following week. And that's always a great moment. And you can make a few plans that way. Now, in other countries, particularly on the continent, it's more normal for that schedule to be done the night before. So, and you sometimes have to ring up on a dedicated answer phone system line and discover what the next day is going to be. So each day you think, am I going to be needed tomorrow? And I remember being out in Amsterdam when my family were really young, which was really close to be able to get, really easy to be able to get back, fly home. And I had a small enough role that I spent day after day when they weren't rehearsing my bit. And I was thinking, I wonder when it's coming up. And it got to Thursday, I remember. And I thought, if they don't need me tomorrow and Saturday, I could just get a flight home now. So the possibility was just on tenterhooks. So I just dropped in at the end of the working day on a Thursday and said to the director, just hovered and said, director, excuse me, can I just ask? He saw me. He said, Roddy, he said, yeah, we haven't used you. Make sure, we'll use you tomorrow. Boom. Also just up in smoke there. So as I say, it's foolish, but it's merely the possibility of being able to get home. Right, I'm going to cede the floor, but before I do, I was just going to say I realise that I shouldn't be here. I should have donated my space to someone from Swopera. There was a group of ladies who got together, mothers who sing in opera, got together and formed a unit to try and nudge opera companies into seeing it from this point of view, because good half of their workforce is female, discuss, and many of them have families, often mothers, but not just that. And they wanted people to take on board this idea, particularly as Claudia says, of scheduling. It's more that than anything else, it seems to me. So I realise I need to go into bat a little bit for them, and hopefully Claudia and I between them can represent some of the things they say.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roddy. Patsy, I move on to you. Welcome to The Exhale. It's the first time that we have the pleasure of having you with us. Patsy, I am familiar with your work, but perhaps you could let our audience know a little bit more about your good self.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And it's great to hear from Claudia and Roderick as well about their experiences. My name is Patsy Gilbert. I started my career as a performer. My genre, I suppose you could call singer for hire. I sort of did whatever I needed to do in any different forum to make ends meet at the time. And also it's the sort of choir arranger and leader. As a performer, I never was working as a performer as a parent, but I worked with many other people who were parents, and particularly in the theatre world, which seems very different to the music world, actually, in terms of how children and parenting is entwined with those things, if you like. However, now I work as the director of the School of Performance at Leeds College of Music. I sort of look after the programs in jazz, classical, folk, foundation year, musical theatre, acting and actor musicianship. There won't be a quiz, so I won't ask you to repeat those. But I look after the sort of strategic development of those programs, and in particular looking after the students on those programs and thinking of them very much as the students who will be the future of our industry, the industry that we're either currently in or the industry as we will be in the future. And I very much see my role as not just preparing those students for an industry as it already exists, but really trying to be a utopian vision of what we would like our industry to be. At Leeds College of Music, I'm very heavily involved with something called the Elevate programme, which is about the empowering and promotion of women across music in general, but particularly music and theatre education. At Leeds College of Music, we have a very particular standpoint in that we have a very small number of female staff and female students in comparison to our male staff and students. And I can give you a whole presentation about why that is and the different instrumentation that breaks down to. So for example, in our classical program, we have far more female students, but they are predominantly singers, and about the kind of disparity that happens in those different kinds of areas. So that's sort of why I'm here. The thing I wanted to say firstly is I think it's really important that Roderick's here, because I don't think that that parenting and performance should just be something for women to consider. I think it's something that men need to consider too, not only because they are, of course, parents who are also trying to perform, but also because particularly in the world of classical music, where a lot of our leaders are male, it's very important that we think about the idea of allyship and this very important feeling of how do we prepare the industry to be ready for parents as performers, and prepare ourselves, prepare the industry to be ready for either women or men in those positions to be able to succeed. And I think that's, again, going back to that idea of education, a very important point, which is we at Leeds College of Music are not just training performers, we are also training future leaders. And so as such, we need to train them as employers and as managers and as those people who are considering those schedules. And that seems very important. So normally in a discussion where I'm talking about women in music or women in music education, I don't talk about the fact that I'm a parent, and I do that on purpose because people would expect me to do it. But I will in this situation because I've been asked about it specifically. So I have a particular viewpoint because I have a 5-year-old daughter who you will hear. She just came in a moment ago actually and asked me about something on Netflix. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I work full-time at Leeds College of Music. I still work as a choir arranger and leader and performer occasionally, but my husband is also a full-time jazz pianist. And he actually takes on the majority of the childcare in our house. So we have by traditional standards, a relatively topsy-turvy world where I go and do the full-time job. My husband works as a performer and I work as the childcare when he's performing, and vice versa. And one of the topics that came up on the introduction to this talk was about whether there is a gender bias in parenthood and performing. And I'm very much looking forward to that part of the conversation because the answer is yes. I also think it's really important to say, and I'll be the first person to mention it, that which is about the current pandemic that we're in. I think that what the current pandemic has shown is how vulnerable our industry is, and how much our industry relies on people being as malleable, as flexible, as affordable, as kind of transient as as convenient as they possibly can be in order to make this industry work. And I say that as somebody who's worked in it for a very long time and adores it. But I really feel like there's a moment of possible change here. That this is sort of giving us a steer to be able to say, is it right that within 2 weeks there are performers who literally cannot afford to eat? Is that okay? And my answer is no, absolutely it isn't. It's an industry which is based on people living in poverty, and that's not reasonable. People do not go into the creative arts to make money, at least I hope they don't, because they're mad if they do. but we cannot be seen to say that being a performer is merely just being given a favor, that we're being allowed to do this wonderful thing. And as a result of doing this wonderful thing, we should therefore be able to be treated as badly as anybody wishes to in order to do the thing that we love. That doesn't seem fair to me. And I think that's all wrapped up in this, which is about how delicate it is, how delicate the industry is that we're in. And the very last thing that I'm going to say, and then I'll stop talking, is, and I've sort of mentioned it already, but I'm very conscious all the time of my responsibility in training our students to go out into the world and not be treated badly. Not that I'm suggesting that that's what anybody said, but to be treated badly as a performer, but also as people who go out into the industry and want to make an industry where as many people as possible can work in it and do their best work, because we are not going to be the employers forever. And I think there's something very systemic that we have to do right at the beginning of all of this, which is about really changing a whole kind of culture of what the industry is about. So slightly less logistical than some of the other issues raised, but I'm very interested in the discussion anyway, and just very pleased to be here to be part of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Patsy, for joining us. I'd like to say a few things, partially because of things that have been brought up here. Or perhaps I should formulate my thoughts as questions, and feel free to butt in anytime. And to all those listening, please feel free to write something in the chat, or if you want to say something where there's a lull, please feel free to undo your microphone, and do tell us your name, because currently I can't see you all speaking at the same time, so if I don't recognize your voice, I apologize. There's a few things I'd like to say, Patsy, and Roddy and Claudia. First of all, thank you yet again for being here and for giving us some of your family time to be with us. I became a mother 6 months ago, and I couldn't believe how during my process of being pregnant to birth, how vulnerable people are, male and female, when they're expecting a child as far as finances are concerned. I have absolutely the utmost respect for any single parent, whether they are musicians or not. The cost of having a child long before the child is there is unbelievable. And I worry, frankly, about some of our counterparts elsewhere in the world who don't have a social system that many of the countries in the EU might have, or even non-EU, I'm in Switzerland right now, to pick them up in this way. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the process of becoming a family. I'd like to pick up on something you said, Patsy, as an idea. If we were to look at our industry and reinform where we're at, I'm not sure whether we should start in the industry or whether we should start at the very seed of ourselves as a humanity. I have been very lucky and privileged to be surrounded by people who have pushed me to be more open-minded about what it is to be a parent. But I think one of the severe problems that we all encounter as people who want to do a job and have a family, and that should be compatible, is that a lot of our health system and a lot of the things that we think about when it comes to having children is with a bias towards the women, and with the idea that a child is a woman's problem. And I do say it quite provocatively, I do apologize. A child is a woman's problem, but in fact a child is a gift for a whole society. And I wonder, can we do something in our mindset to enable that? Because one thing, and that's the third thing I'd like to say, and interrupt anytime, I'm amazed more and more, I don't know whether it's because I've become a mother and I'm more hormonal, or whether it's just something deeply ingrained. There is, for me, this massive, jarring, it's nearly on the border of a certain sense of schizophrenia. We are musicians and artists. We do one of the most gorgeous, beautiful, inspired jobs in the world, if that is to be a job, as opposed to vocation. It's hugely fulfilling. And it is not to be confused with narcissism. Most of us do this for ourselves. We do this because we want to share something. And at the same time, there's this, for me, jarring reality of misanthropy. It's not about a gender thing. It's about a general way that artists and musicians are treated, whether they have family or not, whether, as Claudia said, they are sisters, aunts, uncles. There's a certain sense of ill treatment, whether it is from our very own audiences who demand of us that we give our lives for free for love and that we just pay the rent with that, or whether it is from the people who employ us who don't necessarily give us the sense of value that I feel that artists contribute to society. So that's three things there. Feel free to say anything anytime.
I will happily pick up on your second point, which is about this idea of children being seen as a kind of women's problem. I can't say that I haven't felt a bit like that myself during this coronavirus period at certain moments, but I digress. The first thing I want to say is that it's very difficult to talk about that without saying that there is a kind of inherent structural problem in most organisations in this sense, that even once you start to see women in sort of leadership capacities in these kinds of huge organisations that we see, and they are few and far between, but they are increasing, they are still being expected to succeed in a world which is predominantly created for and by men. Now, when I say that, I don't mean all women and all men. When I talk about a lot of the female male issues in regards to Elevate, I tend to talk about this idea of alpha versus omega, that there is an alpha culture, if you like, and there is an omega culture which is trying to work with it and is constantly battering its head against a brick wall. So I think you're right, and I think that there is a problem in the sense that that the child is seen as a woman's problem, and that isn't true. But I also think that there's something on the other side of that, which is about those things that actually as a mother are your issues, and you have to deal with in a way that men don't have to deal with, even if they are doing the majority of the parenting, as my husband is. So that kind of loss of artistic and possible creative identity, for example, that comes with having children, because of the period of time that you may be out of work, either through pregnancy or through maternity or however that works, and that is fundamental, because our artistry is so entwined with who we are, and that seems very important. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that we are constantly trying to create little pockets for women in a culture that actually hasn't been designed for us. And I think that we can only do that for so long before we say there's something about this whole culture that isn't right. And there has been for many years this feeling of, well, women can go to work if they like, as long as they can still do all the other things that they did before. And we need to break that down. It's not reasonable, and it doesn't help people succeed. And that's not just in performance, that's just in music generally. But I think there's a moment going to come pretty soon where we're going to run out of small pockets we can find in a world that isn't designed for us.
Patsy, when you say it's not designed for us, are you referring to music in general, or?
I think I'm talking, you could apply this to many things, of course, but I'm talking about the sorts of things, that Claudia mentions, for example, where we talk about schedules that work in the way that they do. They work like that because they worked for a certain type of workforce for a very long time. And lots of the things that we do now in the way in which we schedule things, the way in which we create work, the way in which we put work on the stage happens like that, but it's happening exactly the same now as it was 100 years ago. And we need to start saying, is this still right in 2020 that we work like this? Is this still reasonable? And I think we need to fundamentally question everything and not just assume that things that we do because they have to be done that way. We need to start questioning them and saying, why can I not say that I can be home on Saturday? That's not reasonable. Actually, in 2020, that's not okay. And I absolutely understand why that's very hard to turn around to a director who's just given you some work and say, I think it's unreasonable. But I think that's what I mean about systemic change rather than a kind of one person crusade, and an allyship, that ability to say this person has a child and they probably need to leave. We need to help that person. We need to give them the support that they need.
Thank you, Patsy. Roddy, what is your opinion on that? You are a man in this
Oh
industry.
my God.
Get out, get out.
I wanted to pick up on something that Claudia said ages ago, and something that Patsy was talking about just there, and just acknowledge that in a freelance career, there are no systems in place for something to take you through maternity. So if you, for example, are a singer and you happen to be a member of an opera chorus or something, a full-time job, there is a system in place to carry you through.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, as a freelance singer, you can't do that. And when in an office, if you can imagine being replaced on maternity leave by someone, you know that you've got a job to go back to at the end. That's all. That's lovely, to be discussed, but you know what I mean. And in a freelance career, as a young singer is forging their way from job to job, increasing their exposure and what have you, at just the moment where things are flying, they might decide this is time to have a family, or they might not. That decision might be taken out of their hands and they suddenly have a family, at which point there is a falling off. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but there is nothing they can do in terms of keeping that career going. Now, a lot of female singer friends I've known who have been pregnant have had to cope with this, and have done so with varying degrees of terror, because they know that the opera companies, much more so than in the business workplace, are looking at singers becoming pregnant and thinking, oh God, right, we're going to have to cancel them from such a contract, or how are we going to cope with that? We're going to have to write it into the opera somehow. So that is one thing, of course, that men just don't have to face. And of course, with that comes the change of the instrument. If Gwendolyn was thinking that as she became pregnant, someone was going to restring her instrument and just add an extra 2 inches on it, just saw it in and just add an extra. The change in one's body is such that you could come up the other side potentially with a new instrument, and you have to relearn that. And that is also something that when I go to music colleges and we talk about such things, it comes up time again. But young female singers who have the imagination to ask what happens when you want to start a family, it does happen from time to time. When they do ask that, I haven't got much of an answer. But I will say this also, that women have sung since the dawn of time. They've managed it somehow, historically. Although, having said that, interrupting himself, I was speaking to a singer recently who trained in the States, and she said that her sing teacher put pressure on her when she got married. And I don't know quite what turn of phrase she used, but she did suggest that having children would be a negation of her gift, of her vocal gift. There was a feeling in the glory days of singing in the 1950s and 60s that this is a God-given gift, or a gift in some way, and you would screw it up if you had a family. That would be the end of your career. So I could think of some female singers who have not had children for whatever reason, but I wonder if part of it was they're on the top of their game and they knew it would ruin it for them. So.
Thank you, Roddy. Can I ask you, Claudia, and please feel free not to answer if you don't want to. Claudia, I'm a huge admirer of yours. We go back a long time.
Likewise, Gwendolyn as well. Big admirer.
Yeah, very good. You have, if I may say so, you've had a baby a year ago.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful. To go in on what Roddy's asked or said, what is it like to be pregnant and a performer? I mean, particularly when you carry your instrument as one does a baby with you all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly every woman's experience of pregnancy is different. I mean, I was actually particularly sick right through my pregnancy, even actually getting sick on the morning of the day I had my little girl. So it never really it let up for a short time. It let up for about a month and a half, 2 months, where it was just only mornings I was getting sick. But really outside of that, it was kind of all the time. I mean, hyperemesis actually runs in the family. I didn't have hyperemesis. I just had bad bad morning sickness, really. I certainly wasn't hospitalized. I wasn't that bad that I had to go on drips and dehydrated. But I was really fortunate, and it was just serendipitous that my schedule kind of worked out well around that. I mean, I was just towards the end of a tour when I found out that I was pregnant, and then I thought I was Wonder Woman, and because my sister had hyperemesis, and I was like, I'm not getting sick at all, and she was saying that 6 months or at 6 weeks, and sure enough, bang on 6 weeks, I did start getting sick, and then it was after that, actually, I was very fortunate to have a job in Oslo in Norway, which is so progressive, and I didn't, I mean, I hadn't told anyone I was pregnant. I wanted to wait until I had the first scan. So I didn't really feel the need to tell my agent or the opera company. I mean, it was going to be over, it was a very kind of long period, but it would still, I would have only been 5.5 months towards the end of it, which is perfectly fine. So I did tell them, though, when I went over there, because of costume fittings, obviously, I was going to be bigger towards the end of it. And listen, I think it's good to be upfront about that. And especially because I was sick, I'm rehearsals, I mightn't have been completely on my game all the time. And then it was funny, I got a phone call then from my agent going, are you expecting a baby? Because there was just one rehearsal when I was particularly sick. I knew every single toilet in the opera house, actually, very intimately. And, I had to kind of pop out of the room, and then I'd be singing into Nemorino's face, trying not to breathe on him. But yeah, so word travels very, very quickly. But I was just very fortunate that it was it's a very progressive place, and that were just so supportive. And then actually after that, then I did have another job, which I did actually back out of, just because they were a little bit nervous. It was quite a physical production, but ultimately they did leave the decision with me, and I was happy to bow out. I kind of felt it was right at that time. And then when I did have my baby, it was a cesarean section, because she was breech. Just to talk about what you mentioned, Rodney, about your voice changing, I didn't particularly feel a huge change. I thought it was slightly better, actually, which I was fortunate to have that experience. I have known singers that maybe haven't had that, that find it a little bit tougher to navigate after having a baby, and certainly hormones have a huge effect on everything, God. So I actually then got back to work pretty quickly, about 6 weeks after I did my first concert. So I enjoyed the whole experience, and again, just very fortunate with how it worked out and where I was working. And then just to take, I just wanted to explain, by the way, why I jumped in with the Saturday issue, because I think it's quite interesting. My other half is actually, he has a normal job. He's a civilian. He's an accountant in a hospital here, and so it very much 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And I suppose, why is that normal? I suppose it's just more common, really, isn't it, than the schedules that we keep. And 100% I would take Roderick's point about, you do have to accept, I suppose, that the contract is the contract, and do you want to go away for that length of time? And absolutely, yeah, it is a bonus. But I suppose even outside of that, I would like to see what Patsy said, just change. Change coming in, systemic change, because I don't think it's right to have that expectation on artists that you do have to go away for 3 months without seeing your family, and even if you don't have children. But yeah, I think that's a lot to expect. And I think if opera companies as well looked beyond that, I mean, I think certainly when I'm happy in my personal life, I sing better, I perform better, and you will get the best out of me if I even get that weekend. And not that I'm holding an opera company to ransom, I would never do that. I mean, I think I get along very well with my colleagues, and I don't take it personally, which I think is very important as well. But I think you get the best out of people with this kind of change. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a question, Patsy.
Yeah.
There's something I hear when Claudia speaks, which is to be completely expected. And there's something I hear when other women speak, and I'm not suggesting that I don't hear that when men speak, but the there's a different thinking behind it. I'm not sure if you've picked up on it yourself. When Claudia tells us of singing whilst pregnant, she doesn't only know every single toilet intimately for whatever reason, but she probably knows her score that little bit more intimately. She's probably ready to be ill and go on stage and manage herself into those outfits. And she probably has figured out a way to be better than best, not just because she is amazing, and let that be known. Please, if you ever have a chance to listen to Claudia or Roddy indeed singing, go ahead and go to their performances. They're thrilling artists. But like many women in her position, she has to have that edge because that's the way it is. If you are pregnant and not on top of your game, it's not working. I'm not sure if you are familiar with, there's a singer called Gwen Stefani, from No Doubt. I'm not sure if she's still in that. But when I was, I think, 14 or 15, she first became famous. Everybody in Ireland sang her song. And I remember looking at her going, wow, pink hair. I want pink hair. And the next thought was, I can't afford to have pink hair because I'm a girl in the classical music world. And unless I play the stars from the sky, they will tell me that I can't have pink hair because that's just not how it's done.
Yeah.
Patsy, what are your thoughts on women having to be that bit better, or the suggestion that if you want to get it done, give it to a woman? Have a family. Look at me, I picked Joanne for a reason.
Oh God, do you know what? I have so many thoughts on it. It's difficult to sort of quantify them. I think the first thing to say is that everything that Claudia's talking about, I totally recognise. 6 weeks after my daughter was born, I went and sang a soprano for a for a community choir gospel concert over at the ENO at the Coliseum. It was stupid. I don't know why I did it. I had breast milk everywhere. I just remember breast milk everywhere and thinking, why am I here? And I was there because I was absolutely petrified that somebody else would do it. And I only really got that in my mind many years later, because you're in a very vulnerable place anyway, when you've first had a child. So that's the first thing. I thank all the gods that there are no recordings of that particular woman. What I'm going to say is going to sound like it's going to sound like I'm being very kind of women versus men, and I really genuinely want to stress that that's not what this is about. I work with amazing people who are amazing at talking about gender equality in all kinds of ways. I'm talking about this in terms of, again, that idea of alpha structure and alpha culture and omega culture. But I remember being at an event talking about women in music, and lots of tend to be men, but women too get very threatened by that, talking about this idea that there is a kind of inequality, there's a disparity, for all kinds of reasons. And I remember a man saying to me, this happened to be at a jazz conference, but he said to me, I don't see gender, like I just give the job to whoever is the best musician. If I see an excellent woman, then I'd give her the job. And I said, that's the problem. You're waiting for excellent women. And I have seen billions of mediocre men. There's a huge amount of mediocrity that happens in all kinds of places, and women are always expected to be at their best. They're expected to be at the top end of that world to be able to kind of break through that wall, and that happens in lots of different places. So I think that's part of it, which is about women needing to be at the top of their game all the time, and I think that's part of it, and that's part of the pressure. That's an enormous pressure. And the other thing I was going to say was that all of those things that you're talking about in terms of that awareness, that fundamental body awareness that particularly singers have, instrumentalists have too, of course, but singers particularly have, and women feeling like throughout that pregnancy that they still have to be able to sort of deliver and do that work. And of course you do. But I think it's also about understanding your body well enough to know when you need to stop, and that actually that's okay should you need to. And my anxiety is about the people who keep going when they really shouldn't be, that actually they need to take some time. And that's very difficult, to sort of stop and say, actually, I need to just take a moment. I need to come away from this for a moment to be able to look after myself and put myself first, I guess, in that situation. So yeah, so I think I absolutely understand what Claudia's saying, and I see it, and I see it in experiences all the time where women kind of feel like they have to work twice as hard in those periods of time to feel like they're still relevant, which all goes in with that idea as well of as a mother and being a parent, as I mentioned before, about that idea of identity, and your artistry is so linked to your identity, and when you become a parent, male or female, your identity changes so hugely. But we need to give people time to then get used to that, to change what they do, and to acknowledge and to support them when they do change. I think that's how we should be working. One of the things I was just going to mention, if you don't mind, because it came up on the chat, somebody was mentioning, I think it's Bethany was talking about, not being not having a baby because what it'll do to your performance career. And I work a lot in the theatre, straight theatre, quite a lot. And actually, as somebody who went to drama school, that was something that we were taught quite a lot, which was about how to kind of have a longevity of a career that isn't just about the skill, but is also about yourself in the world and the context that you're in. And now working in music education, I see how that is lacking is the wrong word, but it doesn't have the same focus as it does in theatre education. That I was sort of used to, much more of a conversation about what it means to be a woman and be a performer. That doesn't sort of happen the same in musical education in the same way.
Thank you, Patsy. I have two questions for you, Roddy. The first is, what's it like for a man? Do you identify with these issues, the idea of always having to be the best because that's just the way our lives as musicians go? Or do you think it's also a gender thing where women feel like they constantly have to succeed and be on top of their game?
I can't really identify with. I don't really identify with that because I'm a man and I'm also in my 50s, and so I was at Claudia's stage, 20 years ago, a different stage in my career now, and in that sort of area where I'm able to relax and look back at past mistakes. Being in lockdown with my children, who are all grown up now, has been very interesting because they are of a different generation and they use different language about gender, about race. Of course, that's very, very much in the air at the moment. And they look at some of my statements and experiences with a look of frank. They're just appalled by the sort of things that come out of my mouth. So I've learned, for one thing, to be a little bit more careful with my language. It's been fun learning from them, actually. So I realized that I'm a different generation and that things, the way I have behaved in my own family, doesn't exactly have me coming. I'm not really painting a very good picture of myself here. So a lot of what Claudia has described about pregnancy and what also Bethany has just, Bethany, we'll come to you in a minute. What Joanna was saying about the menopause, for example, and even just having periods, for example, that is not something I'm aware of at all. So it's going right back to the beginning when Patsy just laid the cards straight out on the table and said, is there a gender bias? Yes, of course there is, and we all know this. We know that when a guy is thinking, oh, I might get a weekend off, I'll be able to go home, see my wife and get a bit of love. We know that at the same time, the woman is thinking, oh, great, I got the weekend off. I'll be able to go home and see the kids. And so she goes back home to be a mother. The guy goes back home for a rest. I mean, this is an old shape, but and I would hope that we are all aware that things are shifting. As Patsy says, even this pandemic experience gives us a chance to redraw the map in the future as it has been redrawn in terms of race relations at the moment. It's a sort of a gift of a moment for us. But my own experiences are such that would make your hair curl, but hopefully in a way that you would forgive of me. And just to say that I do not remember the conversation that that must have happened at some point with my wife and me. I don't remember the specifics of it when we discussed who would take what role in bringing up our family. But I can tell you that while I was a student at the Guildhall School of Music, and as I was approaching 30, having been a teacher until about, say, 25, 26 years old, she was working in an office there, and basically she kind of maintained me through my Guildhall years. And my first daughter was born 25 years ago when I was in at my last couple of terms at the Guildhall. When I finished at the Guildhall, Miranda quit her job and stayed looking after our daughter and thereafter our family, and has not worked in a formal 9-to-5 full-time setting since then. She has basically been the mother, domestic engineer, I think, whatever you want to call it, ever since. And because she has been at home as the rock of our family, I have been able to go and have the career that I've had in going anywhere in the world, having that freelance career I was mentioning earlier on. And the children have grown up, our 3 children have grown up as sane as they are, brackets discuss, because my wife has been the constant for them. And when I came home from wherever it was, I was, of course, the flavour of the moment for about 60 seconds or so, daddy, 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 and then, you know, they get on with whatever it was. Now, when Miranda, my wife, went away, in those few times over the last 25 years that she's actually been able to go away for a considerable period of time by herself. Now, when she went away and I was at home, you could see them being disturbed. They were rudderless. Not in a bag, we're not dramatic, but I could observe how different it was when she went away, when I went away, and that has been the shape of our family. It's very interesting also for Miranda now. This is back to what Joanna was saying about growing older with this. It's interesting now for Miranda to work out what she is now that the children are older enough and we're empty nesters. So she's thinking, right, what do I do? So a very interesting, long-going conversation. Incidentally, my wife was never a musician, so she had she worked as an office secretary, but an office manager. Secretary was the title, but she was an office manager. So she's never had ambitions to be a musician or anything like that. But the support she has given me through my career has been fundamental to my ability to have a career at all. And she has, of course, been there to pick me up when things are low, and she's been there to look after me and accompany me when things have been great. That has been my manly experience of all this. Not brilliantly helpful to you all, but you know, there you are.
Before I ask another question, just something coming up here in the chat. We are trying to respond to the questions that are being placed in the chat, and please feel free at any point to respond yourselves. One from Aoife Nicochliach. She's just asked you, Roddy, do you think you could have had the same career if your wife was a musician too? Well,
it's very difficult to think and play what ifs. The short answer is I don't think so. A slightly longer answer is I do have lots of singer friends who've married other singer friends and have had families, so I can answer by looking at their experience. And I remember one singer friend passing my godchild over to his wife at the airport once when he came back from a job and she was just flying out. You know, they really struggled. This goes right back to what Patsy said at the beginning about how musicians are living a very precarious existence, as this situation has shown us. I have had, let's be honest about this, I have had a blessed life. If I look back in hindsight, I can see that so many things have just kind of fallen into my lap. It's been glorious, and I am thankful to whomever, certainly to my wife, for it. But do you think you could have had the same career if your wife was a musician too? The same career? No. And I'll tell you one particular thing is that for the last 20 years or so, when an email has come into me saying, Roddy, you've been invited to go and sing here and do this job, and you know something, we've got an offer to come, would you come and sing this? It has never really occurred to me to ask Miranda whether she thinks it's going to be a good idea, whether it's going to fit into her diary, whether, you know, it just, I have answered all those emails throughout my career as on my own, as you know, that just comes to me and I answer them, off they go. It is only really quite recently that the children, that we are empty nesters and children have gone, that I involve Miranda in these discussions now to see if she wants to come along. She used to do that before we had a family. She used to accompany me, and she used to enjoy that a great deal. And now we're able to enjoy that again. But it's not as if I'm asking her permission as such, but she wasn't part of the conversation in the way that my agent and I might be. And I look back and I see that, and I think, that was a thing. So yeah.
Claudia, thank you for being so candid and honest about that. I think that's incredibly wonderful and helps to get perspective. But I meant it in the best possible way.
Good.
Patsy, I have a question for you, and it draws into a little bit one of the questions that have come up here from Cherry in the chat, who writes, how receptive are students, in brackets, all, to having this conversation? You're very welcome to answer that question, or also to answer a question I have, which is, as musicians, whether we are freelancers or employed, what is it that we can do to affect change? I mean, it's one thing to come here and talk about it. It's another thing to actually go out in that world and to have the impression that we feel far too helpless in this whole conversation.
Okay, so I'll answer Cherry's question first, because it's relatively straightforward. I think students are generally quite receptive, and it's difficult because when you're 18, you don't necessarily think about yourself as somebody who has a family, or so I think that's difficult. When we see people at 18, when they come to join us at ELCOM, they tend to say, you know, I will do anything if I can be a first violinist in wherever. And of course, as you get older, your priorities change. So a lot of that conversation with them really is about preparing them to be flexible and preparing them to be resilient. So rather than talking about parenting specifically, or even gender bias specifically, it's more about preparing yourself for the kinds of realities of the industries that you'll be in. I think the other thing is we have a responsibility in education to be utopian. You know, our job is not to reflect what the industry is in the building. Our job in the building is to reflect the industry as we'd like it to be. And so there's a huge amount of conversation about, you know, how we recruit more students, female students at ELCOM, which also links into, I know Roderick mentioned this, about how do we think about attracting more students of colour, how do we look to attract more students from ethnic minorities, different cultural backgrounds, and all of these things. I'm not comparing these things, but I'm saying that they're part of the makeup. That's the development. You know, if you want to see what the industry is going to be like in 10 years time, you need to go to the places where those people are being trained, and it will tell you, you know, that these people are not going to appear out of nowhere. They have to have come from somewhere. So the students are quite receptive, but they're also receptive in an education system, particularly in the UK, which is completely focused on employability, and that is a very difficult position to be in. To go to your second question about what can we do, well, the first of which is, I think that we need to think of ourselves as being proper allies to each other. There is a difference between being an optical ally, as in, you know, looking to be an ally, and actually being one, and making those small changes where you can in the small parts of the industry that you're in. And I don't think that's just for men. I think that's for men and for women. There are a lot of women who, for all kinds of reasons, that actually make it difficult for other women, as well as there are many men who are. It's about everybody doing what they can in their little area. The second thing is I think is about having a network of people. And one of the things I did want to mention, I think this is a good moment, is when I was pregnant with my daughter, my husband and I had spoken quite a lot about the kinds of sacrifices that we'd have to make. And I think it's worth saying that as a parent, there will be sacrifices. You know, I don't think that you're going to be able to live your life exactly as it was before. And I think that's a case for anybody. I don't think just in music. And one of the things my husband and I did, and this is by no means advice because I hate giving advice, is we sat down and we said, well, what are we prepared to sacrifice in order to? Because I think that's important. You know, what will you do? What will I do? How will we work that? Because we didn't have the kind of situation that Roderick's talking about, where there is a kind of person who does one thing and there is a kind of assumption that the other person will do something else. We didn't know. We both had very kind of disparate lifestyles in that sense. So I think it's about talking about those sacrifices. The thing I hadn't prepared for when I got pregnant and I had my daughter was that the performer network that I had, the friends that I had, and they are friends, but actually many of them disappeared. And they disappeared because they either thought that you didn't want to be contacted, or people wouldn't contact you about work because they thought, oh, well, Patsy's had a baby now, so she'll probably not want us to. Or they wouldn't contact me because they wanted to talk about something that was happening in a work environment that I wasn't part of anymore. So I think it's about building networks with people who will keep connected with you throughout that, you know, those periods in your life where you are making those changes, so that you can talk to each other about what you can do as a collective of people. I think that's important too. So that you don't feel like you're on your own, but you feel like, oh, these are things that we share. And I can, you know, I listen to Claudia and I think, oh my goodness, those are things that I recognize. Brilliant. It isn't just me. And keep in contact with those people and keep talking to them. But do what you can in the small universe you're in. It might feel like nothing to you, but it will, like a butterfly effect, it will have huge ramifications somewhere else.
Thank you.
I just want to reiterate. First of all, Patsy, I'm so delighted when you speak to hear that students are being exposed to all of the, you know, ideologies and visions that you have, because I think that's what's needed. I mean, certainly before this chat, just out of interest, I mean, I was Googling, I mean, I knew it already, but I Googled kind of gender equality in classical music, and you know, it's really profound. I mean, right from the top down, from you know, bosses of theatres to conductors to leaders of sections. So it is profound, although harp players are nearly all women, so that was very
It's their fingers, I'm sure.
yeah, oh yeah, I'm cautious as well, so it was very interesting. But yeah, like I just think certainly when I started in the profession, it's natural because God, when you're younger, I mean, the older you get, you really care less. I mean, and that's not in a bad way. Of course, I care about what I do, but you care less what people think of you, and that's something I think that only comes with age. But hopefully, as you say, if we try and make a difference in our own hemispheres, like it'll help. Yeah. And certainly, I'm not afraid to say to my agent anymore, well, I need some time at home. Can I, you know, can I just engage more with opera companies? And you do get results. You know, that if you actually ask and engage, and you ask in a nice way, in a reasonable way, certainly I think I've gotten results lately. So yeah, I think it's to just keep on being proactive.
For sure.
I think that's surely part of the change that's we must all have noticed in the past few years, that opera companies realise they can't not allow that anymore. They are aware that things are changing. You could debate how that fast at the rate of change, but it is happening. That the idea that in the past 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, if you said, I need to go home because I haven't seen my family, they would have laughed at you.
Yeah.
And so we'll find another singer. So yeah.
Can I just add one more point, which because I think it links to what we're saying right now, this second, and I don't want to take us too far on tangent. But I also think that we have to think about the kind of art that we make. And I often think about, now that I have a daughter, far more than I did before I had my daughter, I think very much about the kinds of stories that my daughter sees on stage, in opera, through music, the kinds of music she listens to. If she listens to classical music, who wrote it? When did they write it? Why did they write it? What is it about? And And if I was in a more artistic mood, sometimes people say to me, you know, what did you do as a performer? And I say, oh, I was a storyteller. I'm not saying that now. I was sort of a singer and an actor. But the reason I say that is because our jobs are to tell stories. So we can change the internal structure of who works in classical music. We can change that. I don't think that that's necessarily, I think it's sort of happening, and I think it'll happen over time. And I think we need to do all these small changes. But we also need to think very carefully about what art is telling us about women's lives, particularly in classical music, particularly in opera, which are largely written by men and largely written by white men in the canon. And there's something about that until I had my daughter, I didn't think about as much. And now I think very carefully about what I expose my daughter to in terms of narratives, because art is meant to teach us about life. It's meant to teach us about what it's meant, you know, what the human experience is. And there are some fantastic characters in all kinds of ways, but they tend to be taught through a male lens. And I mean this in theatre as well. So I just don't want, while we talk about structures and we talk about education and we talk about the sort of internal bit, I don't want us to forget about what it is that we put out there as well. And, you know, the art that we put out there into the world and what our responsibility is in that regard as well, to champion the voices of the underrepresented people in the art that we make, and making sure that their experiences are being taught through what we put out there, as much as it is about being reflected in the worlds in which we're in. Sorry,
I would like to just dip into something you mentioned at the very beginning, where you said that you have a lot of experience with gender, the gender bias, and also numbers. I love sometimes to just go back to basic statistics to try and understand what kind of world we're looking at within the realm of music, or in particular classical music. What is it like to be male or female, or indeed of an ethnic minority or any other kind of minority? What is it like to be of a different sexuality as the norm within a classical music field? I mean, we haven't even dipped into the idea of what it's like to be two women wanting to raise a child, or two men wanting to raise a child. We haven't the time, unfortunately, probably. But because you have the experience, Patsy, would you just enlighten us of your knowledge in this way?
I think what you're asking me about is about intersectional kind of issues. Is that right? Or are you asking me about specific data in terms of student numbers?
I'm very interested to know, for example, what is the, how many men versus how many women traditionally would learn a certain part of our trade, be that an instrumental one or an industrial one. And then after that point, what is the likelihood out there to be able to survive as an artist, let alone have a family within that structure?
Okay, so in terms of, let's talk about Leeds College of Music first and foremost. So if I think about Leeds College of Music as a microcosm of what the future of the industry will look like, in our classical music provision, we have around about 50-50 split male and female students. However, of that 50% of the students that are female, around 35 to 40% of them are singers. So the remaining instrumentalists tend to be flautists, violinists, no cellists, but we have a problem with cellists generally, but very few female pianists, and that is something that we're seeing a little bit more in some of the other conservatoires that we work with. What we also see is we see less female tutors. Classical music, actually, in comparison to some of our other programs, is more represented in terms of female to male. So if I was to go to my jazz program, for example, around 80% of the staff and 80% of the students are male, and 20% of the students are female, and around 15 to 18% of them are singers. So it's classical music in that sense is a kind of better split in terms of staff and students. So I think that's the first thing. So lots of the work that we do, we have a very fantastic partnership with Opera North, who are the leading kind of opera production company in the north of England, and they are brilliant. When I work with them in their education department, it is all women. If I work with them in their department which works with schools, it is all women. If I work with them in their departments that are in terms of costume, it is all women. But when I start to look in the areas where it is about strategic management, all men. And it's about the way in which women and men sort of gravitate towards certain parts of that world. In higher education, if I go to sessions which are about equality and diversity, it's all women. There are very few men there. And there's something about people who feel like they're underrepresented being drawn to places where they feel like they're helping other underrepresented people. And that's brilliant. But we also have to remember that it is not the job of the underrepresented groups to solve these problems. And we have to try and incentivize in both ways. So at the same time at ELCOM that I am trying to incentivize more women to play jazz guitar, I'm also trying to incentivize more of our male students to be singers or to work in educational programs, to see that as part of their work, that this isn't work for women to go and do. And it's also worth saying that I don't have male students who are openly saying that. They're being taught that, because all of the teachers they meet are female. All of the people they're meeting in those interactions are female. All of the people they're meeting at the top end of their game as an instrumentalist are male. And so they're being taught that by what they see. So I think that's how we work at ELCOM, as a microcosm of the industry, I guess.
Thank you. Roddy, what is your idea of that? I mean, you've been in this beautiful world of classical music for a while. Have you seen changes? Were there more women before, less women, more men? How do you experience all of this as a man?
I have noticed over the past 20, 30 years, orchestras change, particularly in the early music field. String sections have become by and large female. I remember remarking to the lead horn player of I think it may be the Gabriele consort, but it may have been something else, OAE maybe, when I noticed an all-female horn section, all four horns. There has been a gradual replacement, actually, of men in the early music field, which I just casually noticed. Singing, of course, is a different thing, because with literally one or two examples I could think of in the last year or two, female roles have been sung by women and male roles have been sung by men. And there, of course, there's the whole trouser role tradition in Mozart and Strauss operas and tralala. But other than that, since the dawn of opera, and I'll just leave castrati out of this briefly, but since the dawn of opera, women have had starring roles and have sung title roles. Now, what those stories are about is links into what Patsy said earlier. When you see a glorious singer, I'll take Maria Callas. Actually, Dame Nellie Melba just popped in my mind, because she made the first radio broadcast, I think, and she was a huge star, as big as Caruso at the beginning of the 20th century. So, you know, there's a giant, globally famous singer. But Patsy points out the roles she was playing, the stories she was telling, that might not be quite so much fun for her. Nonetheless, my point simply is that whereas you could see an orchestra like the Vienna Philharmonic, you could see them being exclusively male, with the exception of the harpist, and then have that challenged, fairly recently in general terms. In singing, it has not been this, because we have had to have female singers there. So, to answer your question, Gwen, just remembering what it was, it's mostly in the orchestras that I've seen things change, and I have seen things change well for women. It's fascinating what Patsy is saying about Opera North and about Leeds College at the moment, and seeing what is currently right now obvious by the way that people choose. And I'm just examining at the moment at one of the universities. I've been looking at online submissions, and her statistics are borne out entirely. You know, it's all women with a number of men. Just a point I make about that, I was saying only this morning that the male singers on this course, as I judge them, I would say are about 5 to 10 years behind the female singers in terms of vocal development. So going back to what Joanna was saying again about how women mature, just at the point when men are in their 40s and 50s and 60s and thinking, right, I actually worked out how to use my instrument. I have the brains now to know what to do. I can feel, I can emote. I've got everything's in place. Go. And then the most fantastic, for me, baritone roles come my way. At that moment, women at the same age are being replaced by the young soubrettes who come through, because just as they get an idea of how to work the instrument, I think of Renée Fleming and the people that Kirite Kana in her heyday. You have to be a fantastic superstar to be offered parts when you're a soprano of 55, 60. So, you know, let's see what we can do to change that then.
Thank you, Rodney. We've had a question which I found very interesting from Bethany, who asks, there are more women in orchestras now. Do you know if any of these women have decided not to have family because of their career, or are they able to keep a full orchestra job while having children? I'd just like to, not knowing stats, and I would love for your opinion on this, Patsy, mention something my father told me, which I also see in teaching. I'm a violin professor, and I've been working in the university world for the last 8-9 years. And I see primarily female violinists. And of course, I asked my father, who is also a violinist and is the former concertmaster of the Amsterdam Phil. He worked there for 30 years, as did my mom, who's a viola player. So I've had a very sort of, shall we say, a neutral point of view at home. And there is a suspicion that for those kind of jobs in orchestras, men are gravitating towards them less so than women because they're concerned of pay. So a lot of men apparently are now gravitating towards jobs where an income is more secure, whereas women finally have been able to study in the first place, which is something that wasn't happening. Let's look at female composers at some point, which, by the way, we will at the Exhale. We will be looking at female composers and female conductors, and male and female. So I'm wondering, Patsy, is there any truth in what I've been observing, that there do seem to be more men more women studying in the last 20 years or so, and could that have something to do with income rather than a decision to have a family or not?
Well, I certainly think that there are more female, there are certainly more females who are studying musical instruments in general. I mean, you know, I think we see an increase of women studying in music conservatoires, for example. Here I am banging my drum again. It wasn't that long ago that women weren't allowed to go into higher education in the grand scheme of things. You know, if you think about the fact that it really, we're talking maybe 100 years since women really started to come into higher education, and so there's a whole heap of time before that men have a real starting leap, and I mean mankind as opposed to men generally, obviously. So yes, there are certainly more women who are applying for those roles. I would also say that there is a kind of shift in the sense that there is an expectation that as a woman, as a young woman, you can do anything you want to do, you can go and you can do, and that seems to have sort of shifted. There are all kinds of cultural problems with that underneath it, but I think the general feeling is, you know, if you want to go and do that, then you can do that. If you want to go and be an engineer, you can be an engineer. If you want to be a plumber, you can do it. Brilliant. And I have no issues with that. Of course, that's fantastic. I don't think that we then tell them the reality of what it's like when you get out there into the industry. And I think that's part of the training. I also think that we're still working in an industry where we're being allowed to be in it, as opposed to it's being made for us. And I think that's something that that again, we don't necessarily train our young people to do. And I think we miss a trick there. And we also, you know, we need to hand the baton on, if you like, and give them the ownership to make those changes in the industry to do that. But I certainly think that women feel more like they can go and be part of any field that they want to be. There's lots of research which is about, I don't know if you've heard this, and I'm just about to sort of paraphrase it to nonsense, but here we go. That if a man looks at a job description and he hits sort of one or two of the things that you're meant to have, he will always apply. Whereas a woman will not apply unless they hit all of the things that they're meant to be able to do in the job interview or the job description. And again, I think that's where we have to be very careful. There's a lot of work that we need to do with women before they even get to the point where they interview or audition or apply for something, about saying to them, you deserve to be here and you are able to be here and nobody is allowing you to be here. You should be. You are absolutely integral to what is going on. And that's what I mean about the kind of cultural systemic change that needs to happen, as opposed to, well, we've let women have the vote, you know. We need to actually change the voting system to make sure that it's fair and equal. And it's the same sort of thing in the kind of work that we see here. And that at LCOM is the next stage of what we do, really, which is about saying to our students, telling them what the reality is, making them angry about that, and then saying, well, what are you going to do to change it?
Thank you, Patsy. I'd just like to point out one thing that I've read on this topic and that I've experienced. I've even experienced it here in the Exhale in various forms. It tends to be thus that men are more likely to put up their hand and go, I would like to have a raise in my income. Or, for example, to say, what I do is not for free. I work for it. I need to pay the rent from it. And whether it's singing or whether it's carpentry or whether it's being a banker or whether it's driving a bus, it's my time and it's my skill. And I deserve, like anyone else, to be paid. And I see a lot of women finding a different stance on that. And I wonder, does it have something to do with the general demeanor of women that perhaps they are? I mean, we know this from science. The way that the brain of a woman works is different than the way a man's brain will work in certain areas. And I wonder, has that to do with our upbringing, or has that to do with the way we think, or is that an underlying problematic of not feeling like we are good enough or like we deserve it after a lot of times, like there's a kind of a collective consciousness that pushes us in this direction? Patsy, have you seen that happening yourself? Is there any information that you have from that?
No, other than to say yes, it happens all the time. There's a real kind of problem with that, in the sense that women, that when I do this talk about Elevate, the piece that we do, the title of that talk is Making Space for Women. It's not let's make women equal, let's give women jobs. It's make space for women, make space for them to be themselves, to not have to come here and compete with other things, to compete with systems that don't work for them. And I think that's really, really important. I can see there's a whole conversation that's happening on the chat, which is about orchestras, for example. And that's the kind of logistical problem, you know, about how do we make this work? How do we... But it's a conversation that sort of happens largely around women. What will the woman do if she decides to have a family, as opposed to what is the repercussions of having a family unit, and how do we deal with that? So I think there's so many examples that I can give you where that happens. And students, one of the saddest things sometimes about working with students is that not only do they see it happening, they also think, and this is the point I keep coming back to, which is about questioning. They think that that's just what should happen. And I think it's always about questioning, you know, question everything. Nothing happens because it has to happen like that. It happens like that because it was designed by somebody where that was the best way of working for them. Mm. And I think it's always just worth questioning that wherever you are. I'm very lucky because I work in an institution where I can question things, and that's okay. Well, I mean, to be honest, I'd do it anyway. But I'm very lucky that I'm able to do that. As a freelancer, as a young freelancer, I don't think I would have been in the same position. It's very difficult to compare because I wasn't in the same situation then. I think it's very difficult, but that's what I'm talking about in terms of networks, joining up with other women who feel the same as you do, or men, you know, male allies who want to be part of this movement with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I have the luxury of having a husband who has a very stable job. So, you know, financially, that's never been an issue. I mean, I'm financially secure because of that. So I think it allows you to be a bit braver. But again, coming back to what you said, Patsy, in this time, in the pandemic, I mean, my heart goes out to couples who are both from the industry and both artists, and it must be so difficult. And I think you do have to be so brave to speak up when you don't have as much security, you know. Absolutely. You really do. And it takes a lot of bravery, I think. But hopefully, you know, conversations like this kind of reinforce the importance of it.
Yeah, and that's why it's important that, and it's very easy to say and much harder to do, but that's why it's so important that the people who are represented, who do see themselves, who do see that they have that ability and that power to be able to speak, do it on behalf of the people who can't. So my job is not just to say, oh, well, I'm at LCOM and it's fine, I'll just deal with. It's also to try and make the world better for my students, but it's also to try and champion those freelance musicians who I know are not in the same position as I am. We are all in a situation somewhere where we are privileged over somebody else, even if we are underprivileged in another capacity. And we have to acknowledge our privilege where it is and do what we can where we can. That's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I would like to just very briefly mention, for those who will potentially join us at another time, the chat in brief, because there's been some amazing things going on. Aside from the questions that we've tried to answer, there's been some very interesting things asked. It started off with a question about whether women have decided not to have a family because of their career, when one sees that there are more females in orchestras than male. And to that, Joanne Green has responded, in the UK, most contract orchestras will allow job share or a percentage of the job. In the BBC, you can 50%, 40%, or depending on who is doing the other half, whatever suits. This helps facilitate family life. And Aoife has mentioned that she thinks that it depends on the childcare in the country that you work in. Sometimes the income will all go to childcare. That is something you see, for example, in many countries actually, that women are working in order to be able to or men are working in order to ensure that their children are looked after during that time. And Dale Culliford, who is one of our core faculty and is in on this cafe this evening, has written, in the orchestra I play in brackets, the Halle, many of my female colleagues have children and are well supported with maternity leave. Many maybe later choose to take a job share, which is an option. Some have had as many as 4 children while in a high-profile and stressful principal role in the orchestra. Bear in mind, this is a contract rather than freelance orchestra, so it is maybe more stable for family life. So all you potentially orchestral members out there, it's the Halle you want to go to. Thank you very, very much. We are over time already. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us tonight. Patsy, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise and for your bravery and courage to talk with us. I hope it's not your last time at the Exhale, because there's so many other things we'd love to talk to you about. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everybody for contributing their comments as well. It's really great to learn as part of these as well, so thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Claudia, for taking time out from your family to be with us tonight. I can't wait to hear you back on stage, and thank you very much for your thoughts and your contribution and your honesty, which I think goes a long way to shedding light on being a woman in the world of opera. Thank you so much. And Roddy, thank you for taking time for us. It's been wonderful to see you and wonderful to hear your open and honest words, and thank you for being thrown in. You've been unfortunately outnumbered on the panel. That was not on purpose. Next time I promise to get one more man on board, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I'm going to let's see, well, I'm going to make a mistake. That's the first thing I'm going to do. I was about to say that I was going to try and cancel the spotlight video in order for everyone to be able to see themselves, and say goodbye to one another, and hopefully you will join us again at another moment in time. Feel free to ask questions, feel free to send questions in, and we will try to collate these and send them off to the relevant artists or faculty involved in today's class. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Joanne, for taking time out to help co-host this. And yeah, see you all very soon at the Exhale. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. Thank you.
Thank you, Patsy. Thank you to everyone. Take care.